Rome did not announce the end of the Republic with banners or final proclamations, but with a gradual settling of dust over familiar stones, as if the city itself had exhaled and decided to speak no further about what had just passed. The streets still filled each morning with footsteps and voices. The Forum still echoed with business conducted in measured tones, and the Tiber continued its slow, indifferent movement beneath the bridges. Yet something essential had been quietly withdrawn. It could be felt in the spaces between words, in the way conversations ended sooner than they once had, and in the careful avoidance of certain names that no longer seemed to belong to the present. Rome appeared orderly, even calm, but this calm was maintained through omission rather than peace, and the city learned to live with the weight of what it chose not to remember. Along the marble paving stones, worn smooth by generations of ambition, the past lay flattened and polished, its sharper edges removed so daily life could proceed without interruption. In the early years after the Republic's fall, the city's physical form changed very little, and that was precisely the point. Temples remained open, statues remained upright, and the facades of old houses still faced the streets with familiar proportions. What shifted instead was the invisible map by which Romans understood their world. Certain doorways were no longer entered, certain thresholds no longer crossed, though nothing marked them as forbidden. A passerby might glance at a once grand residence and feel only a vague uncertainty, unable to recall who had lived there or why the house now stood quiet. Inside, dust gathered along the edges of mosaic floors, settling into patterns that echoed the silence. Wooden chests remained unopened, their contents irrelevant to the present order, while courtyards that once received guests now collected rainwater and fallen leaves. Absence became architectural, shaping space as decisively as walls and columns ever had. The Forum, heart of the old political life, continued to function with disciplined regularity. Clerks arrived early, their tablets pressed against their chests, and magistrates took their places beneath porticos where shadows pooled even at midday. Decrees were read, disputes were resolved, and records were kept with meticulous care. Yet the language of governance had changed, smoothing itself into forms that avoided the past. Lists of consuls no longer extended backward as far as they once had, and genealogies, once recited with pride, stopped abruptly at safe points agreed upon without discussion. The machinery of administration moved forward, efficient and impersonal, creating continuity through careful trunking. Nothing needed to be declared erased. It was enough that no one wrote certain things down anymore. Beyond the Forum, the city's neighborhoods absorbed the same quiet adjustment. Bakers lit their ovens before dawn, the smell of bread rising into narrow streets where shutters opened cautiously, revealing faces already trained in discretion. Merchants arranged their wares with the same practiced gestures, though some had learned to remove portraits or inscriptions that once signaled old alliances. In private rooms, small domestic shrines were rearranged, ancestral masks taken down and stored away, not destroyed but rendered unseen. The household gods remained, but the stories attached to them grew shorter, simplified for a safer present. Children learned these stories without knowing what had been omitted, accepting the fragments as whole. The process was not violent, nor was it dramatic. It unfolded through routine decisions made in modest rooms, where men sat at plain tables and adjusted records with careful hands. A name was omitted here, a property reassigned there, a legal reference updated to reflect current realities. Couriers carried sealed messages through the city at unremarkable hours, their routes blending into the daily circulation of goods and news. Each action was small enough to seem inconsequential, but together they formed a system of forgetting that required no spectacle to function. The Republic did not fall in a single moment. It dissolved into a series of practical choices that favored stability over memory. Walking through Rome at dusk, one could sense the city's effort to maintain its composure. The light softened the edges of buildings, and shadows lengthened across the stones, blurring distinctions that once mattered greatly. From open windows came the low murmur of conversation and the clink of tableware, sounds of continuity that reassured even as they concealed loss. Lamps were lit one by one, their flames steady, illuminating rooms where decisions were no longer debated but implemented. The air carried the smell of oil and smoke, familiar and grounding, anchoring the present firmly in place. In public spaces, statues of honored figures still stood, though some had been repositioned, their inscriptions subtly altered or removed. Visitors passed them without pause, no longer guided by memory to look more closely. The city had learned how to repurpose its own monuments, allowing them to signify endurance rather than lineage. Stone proved adaptable, willing to bear new meanings without protest. What could not be adapted was quietly ignored. Left to weather and time. Archives grew thicker with documents that described the present in exhaustive detail while offering only selective pathways into the past. Scrolls were stored in orderly rows, their labels precise, their contents unremarkable in isolation. Together, they formed a record that appeared complete to any casual reader. Only careful comparison revealed the gaps, the sudden disappearances of families once central to public life. These absences were not explained. They were simply there, like missing pages no one thought to replace. The silence they created was institutional, reinforced by habit and convenience rather than fear. Rome adjusted its rhythms accordingly. Festivals continued, but their origins were spoken of more generally, detached from specific patrons or ancient promises. Songs were sung with verses forgotten or shortened, their melodies carrying on without the full weight of their words. Memory became abstract, a shared agreement to honor the idea of the past without dwelling on its details. In this way, the city protected itself from the fractures beneath its surface, smoothing them over with ceremony and routine. By the time the Republic had fully receded into history, Rome had already learned how to live without it. The transition left no single scar, only a subtle rearrangement of attention and record. What remained was a city composed, efficient, and inwardly restrained, moving forward on foundations that included both stone and silence. The erasure was complete not because it was thorough, but because it was ordinary, folded into the daily life of a city that valued order above all else. There was a time when the family's name moved easily through Rome, spoken without caution in atriums and along porticos, written into invitations, contracts, and official roles with the same casual certainty as dozens of others that formed the Republic's governing fabric. They were not singular, and that was the source of their strength. Their lineage extended backward through well-documented generations, each name resting comfortably beside magistracies held, marriages arranged, and obligations fulfilled. In the crowded hierarchy of Rome's elite, they occupied a stable tier, neither precariously ambitious nor conspicuously dominant, and their presence within civic life was understood as part of the city's natural order. Their houses stood on respectable streets, their doorways marked by worn thresholds crossed daily by clients and visitors who came not for spectacle but for routine business, conducted in measured voices. The family's story, at this stage, was not one of drama but of continuity. Reinforced each year by repetition, their ancestors had risen gradually, benefiting from alliances carefully cultivated rather than sudden fortune. Marriage linked them to other established houses, creating bonds reinforced by shared meals and inherited expectations. These unions were recorded plainly, noted for dowries exchanged and political compatibility rather than romance, and they placed the family securely within Rome's dense web of obligation. At public ceremonies, members of the household appeared where they were expected to appear, dressed appropriately, their names announced without pause. No one strained to remember who they were, because remembrance was unnecessary. They belonged to the background structure of authority that allowed the Republic to function, a supporting column rather than a focal statue. Within the Senate, their participation followed a familiar pattern. Speeches, when given, were competent and restrained, aimed more at reinforcing consensus than reshaping policy. Votes were cast with an eye toward stability, reflecting the family's preference for endurance over innovation. Younger members observed these proceedings from benches worn smooth by generations before them, absorbing not just political positions, but the unspoken etiquette that governed when to speak and when silence was more effective. Advancement came as expected, step by step, through offices that required diligence rather than brilliance. Each appointment confirmed what Rome already assumed, that this family would continue to serve, reliably and without disruption. Beyond formal politics, their influence extended through quieter channels. Clients gathered each morning in shaded vestibules, waiting patiently to receive guidance or modest assistance. These interactions were brief, efficient, and reciprocal, reinforcing bonds that were social as much as economic. Freedmen managed properties and accounts, their loyalties secured through steady employment and inherited association. In marketplaces and law courts, the family's name carried enough weight to smooth transactions without drawing attention. Their power lay not in commanding the city's gaze, but in shaping its everyday operations. Moving through familiar routes that connected household, office, and forum. The domestic spaces they inhabited reflected this unremarkable authority. Rooms were furnished with care rather than extravagance, their walls decorated with ancestral images that emphasized continuity. These portraits did not dramatize heroism, They catalogued service. Each face represented a life that had adhered to expectation, contributing incrementally to the family's standing. Inside chambers, chests held documents carefully folded and arranged, records of loans, marriages, and civic duties that traced the family's integration into Rome's systems. Candlelight revealed these objects without mystery, illuminating a past that felt solid and accounted for. Education within the household was similarly practical. Sons were taught rhetoric and law not to distinguish themselves, but to meet the demands of public life competently. Daughters learned the social management necessary to maintain alliances, their roles understood as essential to the family's endurance. Tutors emphasized precedent and tradition, grounding instruction in examples drawn from Rome's established order. The future presented itself as a continuation of the present, shaped by inherited responsibilities rather than personal ambition. No one spoke of destiny. They spoke of duty. In public rituals, the family's participation blended seamlessly into collective observance. They sponsored games and repairs at expected intervals, their contributions measured and appropriate. Names were inscribed briefly on plaques that marked civic generosity without excessive display. At funerals, eulogies recited familiar accomplishments, situating the deceased within a lineage that seemed as permanent as the stones beneath the procession's feet. These moments reinforced the impression of permanence, suggesting that the family's presence was as much a part of Rome as its streets and institutions. Their relationships with other houses were governed by mutual recognition rather than rivalry. Agreements were negotiated quietly, disputes resolved through intermediaries who understood the value of discretion. The family's reliability made them desirable partners, their predictability a form of currency in a system that valued balance. When political tensions rose elsewhere, their response was measured restraint, maintaining distance from extremes while continuing to fulfill their roles. This position protected them, for a time, by aligning them with the Republic's procedural core rather than its volatile edges. To walk through Rome during these years was to encounter the family indirectly, through names spoken in passing, through signatures on documents, through familiar figures seated where they had always sat. Their prominence required no explanation because it was unexpected. They did not dominate narratives or provoke commentary. They occupied space quietly, reinforcing the structures that supported everyone else. In this way, their history was woven into the city's fabric so thoroughly that it did not stand apart from it. They were Rome, in miniature, functioning as expected within a system that had room for them. This period of visibility left behind records that appear almost deliberately plain, devoid of drama and marked instead by consistency. The family's story, as preserved in these years, offers no sense of impending loss or transformation. It reads as an account of stability achieved and maintained, of a name spoken aloud because there was no reason not to speak it. Only later would this normality acquire significance, as the quiet completeness of their integration made their eventual disappearance harder to detect, absorbed into the same routines that had once sustained them. The removal of the family from Rome's memory did not begin with accusation or spectacle, but with paper, ink, and the calm authority of administrative language. In narrow offices where light entered reluctantly through high-set windows, clerks unfolded scrolls and adjusted their posture, preparing to copy what had already been decided elsewhere. The words they transcribed were formal, measured, and precise, leaving no room for interpretation. Decrees referred to efficiency, consolidation, and the realignment of civic records, framing absence as correction rather than loss. Names were treated as elements within a system, capable of being reassigned, abbreviated, or omitted altogether, and the process by which this occurred followed established precedent. Each change was justified by reference to stability, the preservation of order, and the need for clarity in an evolving state. Property records were among the first instruments employed. Ledgers listing holdings across the city and countryside were reviewed line by line, their columns neat and uniform. Where the family's name appeared, marginal notes were added, referencing new custodianship or temporary seizure under legal authority. Villas and townhouses were not destroyed, they were reclassified. Ownership shifted through mechanisms that appeared neutral, their language emphasizing continuity of use rather than disruption. Tenants were informed through brief notices delivered by silent couriers who neither explained nor apologized. The land itself remained unchanged, its fields tilled and its walls maintained, as if the absence of a name could not disturb the soil beneath it. Genealogical records underwent a similar adjustment. In archives where family trees had once been traced with careful pride, lines were shortened or redirected. Scribal hands scraped away ink, leaving faint impressions beneath the surface, then rewrote connections in forms that closed neatly without gaps. These revisions did not invent new histories so much as compress existing ones, allowing certain branches to end quietly. Official genealogies presented a coherent narrative that required no explanation, and over time, the altered versions became authoritative through repetition. What was not included ceased to be consulted. Inscriptions posed a more visible challenge, though even here the solution was procedural. Stonecutters were commissioned to alter plaques and dedications, their work precise and economical. Letters were removed or recut, spaces smoothed to accommodate new text or left deliberately blank. Passersby rarely noticed the difference, and those who did had little reason to question it. The city was accustomed to renewal, to the reworking of surfaces in response to political change. Monuments adjusted themselves to the present with practiced ease, absorbing revision into their long existence. Legal language played a crucial role in maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. Documents referenced statutes and precedents that framed each action as necessary and lawful. The vocabulary was consistent, drawing from a well-worn lexicon that emphasized obligation and authority. Nowhere did the texts express intent to erase. They described alignment, clarification, and compliance. By adhering strictly to form, the state ensured that no individual action appeared extraordinary. The cumulative effect, however, was comprehensive, leaving little trace of the family's former standing within official memory. The clerks who carried out this work did so methodically, their days structured by routine. They sharpened their styluses, prepared fresh ink, and worked through stacks of documents with steady concentration. Their labor required attention rather than reflection, and the repetition itself became a form of insulation. Each adjustment was small, but together they reshaped the archive, creating a version of Rome's past that aligned seamlessly with its present governance. The absence of drama was essential, allowing the process to proceed without resistance or remark. Outside these offices, the city continued its rhythms. Couriers moved through streets with sealed messages tucked beneath their cloaks, delivering instructions that would be enacted without discussion. In private houses, administrators received these communications and implemented them, with the same discretion they applied to all matters of estate management. Contracts were updated, seals replaced, and correspondence redirected. The machinery of disappearance relied on cooperation rather than coercion, on the shared understanding that compliance was both prudent and expected. Cultural practices adapted accordingly. Public readings of histories emphasized episodes that supported the new order, omitting references that no longer aligned with sanctioned narratives. Teachers adjusted their lessons, drawing from approved texts that presented a streamlined account of Rome's development. Over time, these omissions became invisible, their absence normalized through familiarity. Memory narrowed not through force, but through habit. As generations encountered only what remained available to them, the process extended even into religious observance. Dedications associated with the family were reassigned or allowed to lapse, their rituals absorbed into broader civic practices. Priests followed revised calendars that reflected updated patronage, ensuring continuity without specific attribution. The gods themselves were not said to notice, their worship proceeding uninterrupted. Sacred space, like civic space, proved adaptable, capable of accommodating change without protest. Throughout this transformation, the tone of official life remained calm. There were no public trials, no proclamations of disgrace. The family's name simply appeared less often than not at all. Its disappearance framed as administrative necessity rather than moral judgment. By presenting erasure as a matter of record-keeping, the state avoided confrontation with the emotional dimensions of loss. What could not be expressed was not debated. In the end, the mechanisms of disappearance succeeded because they mirrored Rome's existing systems. They relied on structure, repetition, and adherence to form qualities that had long defined the Republic's governance. By employing these same tools, the new order ensured that removal felt like maintenance rather than rupture. The family faded from view not through sudden violence, but through the steady accumulation of minor adjustments, each justified, documented, and filed away. What remained was an archive that appeared whole, its silence embedded so deeply within its pages that it no longer called attention to itself, standing instead as a testament to how thoroughly order could be preserved through omission. When the family's name receded from public record, it did not vanish alone, but carried with it a web of quieter lives whose connection to power had always been indirect, practical, and conditional. These individuals did not appear in decrees or revised genealogies. yet the effects of administrative change reached them with equal certainty. In modest apartments, above workshops, in rural estates managed on behalf of absent owners, and in the shaded edges of great houses now reassigned, adjustments were made without ceremony. Clients who had once queued each morning beneath a familiar doorway learned to redirect their steps, aligning themselves with new patrons whose names now carried weight. The transition was rarely discussed aloud. It occurred through glances exchanged, through absences noted, through the slow recalibration of daily habits shaped by necessity, rather than allegiance. Freedmen were often the first to sense the shift. Trained to read subtle changes in household rhythm, they noticed when correspondence ceased to arrive, when seals were replaced, when instructions grew less specific and more cautious. In storerooms and accounting chambers, they updated records to reflect new authorities, copying figures into ledgers that bore unfamiliar headings. Loyalty, once expressed through continuity of service, gave way to adaptability. The skills that had secured their position under one household were applied seamlessly to another, their labor following ownership as property did. These men did not frame their choices as betrayal. They understood them as survival within a system that offered stability only to those who remained useful. Distant relatives experienced the change differently, often with a delay that softened its edges. Living beyond the city, or connected through marriages several generations removed, they heard of developments through fragmented reports carried by travelers or letters that avoided detail. Some found their names quietly excluded from invitations. Others noticed delays in legal proceedings that once moved swiftly. In response, they adjusted their affiliations, emphasizing connections that remained intact while allowing weakened ties to lapse. Family histories were recited with slight alterations, emphasizing safer branches and omitting those now absent from favor. Memory became selective, shaped by the practical demands of continued acceptance. Clients, whose dependence had always been openly transactional, adapted with the least resistance. Their relationship to the family had been defined by access and assistance, not sentiment, and when that access disappeared, they sought alternatives. New routines formed as they attached themselves to emerging centers of authority, bringing with them the same expectations and obligations. In this way, the structure of patronage remained intact even as its participants shifted. The system absorbed loss by redistributing need, ensuring that no void remained visible for long within the city. Former allies navigated the transition with careful neutrality. Shared dinners grew less frequent, invitations politely declined or indefinitely postponed. Correspondence adopted a tone of general goodwill, avoiding references to past cooperation. These adjustments preserved social equilibrium, allowing relationships to fade without confrontation. Silence performed the work that accusation might once have done, creating distance without requiring explanation. The absence of conflict was itself a sign of adaptation, a recognition that visibility carried risk while obscurity offered protection. In workshops and markets, the change registered only faintly. Artisans who had supplied goods to the family redirected their services, their loyalty bound to commerce rather than identity. A potter's mark remained the same, though the destination of his wares shifted. A scribe continued to copy texts, altering only the names that appeared within them. These workers did not record their experiences. Their adjustments were absorbed into the routine of labor, leaving no trace beyond continuity of trade. The city's economic life smoothed over the transition, its momentum indifferent to individual histories. Some individuals chose withdrawal instead of realignment. Older retainers, whose sense of belonging was anchored to long service, retreated into quieter roles, managing smaller properties or living on modest stipends. Their world narrowed, not through coercion, but through the erosion of opportunity. In their homes, objects associated with former prominence remained, handled carefully and stored away. These artifacts were not displayed. They existed as private reminders of a connection that could no longer be acknowledged. Memory persisted here, contained within walls that offered no public voice. Religious spaces reflected similar patterns of adaptation. Devotional practices continued, but dedications once associated with the family were absorbed into collective observance. Priests adjusted their records, ensuring that rites proceeded without disruption. Worshippers followed revised customs without question, guided by habit rather than doctrine. Faith, like patronage, demonstrated its capacity for accommodation, sustaining continuity by dissolving specific associations into broader forms. Across these varied lives, the common thread was political change did not inspire protest or nostalgia. It prompted calculation. Each individual assessed risk and opportunity within the limits of their position, choosing paths that preserved stability. These choices were rarely articulated as moral decisions. They were framed instead as adjustments to circumstance, responses to a landscape that had subtly shifted. In this way, survival replaced loyalty not through ideological transformation but through the practical demands of living within Rome's systems. The network beneath the names adapted quietly, its transformations leaving little mark on official record. The absence of testimony was itself indicative of success, demonstrating how thoroughly the process integrated into existing structures. Lives continued, relationships reformed, and obligations fulfilled under new alignments that soon felt familiar. What had once been a defined constellation of connections dissolved into the broader pattern of the city, indistinguishable from countless others that had shifted before. Rome absorbed these changes with practiced efficiency, its social fabric resilient precisely because it could redistribute allegiance without pause, ensuring that the loss of one name did not disrupt the continuity of everyday life. In the decades that followed the systematic disappearance of the family, Rome evolved with a quiet inevitability. The processes that had begun in the shadows of small offices and dimly lit archives, rippling outward to shape the very structure of the city and the mechanisms of its governance. The absence of the bloodline became absorbed into the fabric of administration, its omission treated as a natural condition rather than a deliberate act. And this omission, repeated and reinforced through generations of clerks, scribes, and magistrates, helped establish a precedent by which memory could be managed, curated, and reconstituted according to the needs of power. Imperial authority, emerging from the fracturing of the Republic, relied not merely on armies or conquests, but on the meticulous arrangement of what was remembered and what was allowed to lapse. Every document that listed consuls, every account of a census, every ledger of property transferred or retained, now carried with it the subtle echo of erasure, shaping future decisions without a single word of explanation. The city, with its marble and brick, statues and arches, absorbed these quiet absences so seamlessly that the machinery of power itself became intertwined with the selective cultivation of history. Buildings that had once belonged to the family were repurposed, their function reframed to suit the needs of the expanding administrative state. Villas in the hills were maintained as provincial offices or the occasional residence of newly elevated senators, whose loyalty was measured not in tradition but in obedience. Urban houses, stripped of the names and inscriptions that had marked their lineage, accommodated minor magistrates or emerging bureaucrats whose presence appeared unremarkable against the city's vast backdrop. Courtyards once filled with private ceremonies now hosted meetings of functionaries whose purpose was procedural rather than social. The shifting of furniture and the arrangement of documents carrying weight in ways that no public display could reveal. Even within these walls, the invisible shadow of the erased family remained, detectable only in the spaces left intentionally vacant, in empty niches or drawers once dedicated to correspondence now redirected toward other records. Memory, or the deliberate absence of it, had become as structural as stone. Administrative norms expanded alongside these physical transformations. Registers of magistracies were compiled with increasing attention to consistency and completeness, incorporating deliberate silences where once a name might have appeared. These omissions were not remarked upon, yet they functioned as markers for officials and scribes who understood, without articulation, the boundaries of permissible reference. By structuring information in this way, the state reinforced the authority of the new order while simultaneously ensuring continuity. Knowledge was retained in the hands of those who maintained it, but selectively applied to shape perception. The careful calibration of inclusion and exclusion created a form of institutional memory in which absences, once established, became as permanent as the records themselves. Future magistrates, encountering these registers, would interpret them as complete, authoritative, and naturally coherent, never noticing that gaps in lineage or influence had been deliberately constructed on a wider societal scale. The family's erasure contributed to a broader cultural reshaping. Historians who recorded events in the imperial period worked within a framework defined by precedent, emphasizing continuity of authority, the maintenance of civic rituals, and the accomplishments of those whose names persisted. Texts compiled for educational use reflected these priorities, favoring narrative cohesion over exhaustive inclusion. Genealogies became streamlined, emphasizing branches that aligned with contemporary structures of power while absorbing absent lines into general reference or leaving them unmentioned. In public ceremonies, new patronage networks assumed the visibility once granted to the family. their names inscribed on monuments, their presence invoked in formal orations. These adjustments, subtle and cumulative, ensured that the past was understood through a lens that reinforced the stability of the present, transforming erasure into an instrument of governance rather than a moment of personal or familial loss. The mechanisms by which memory was managed extended into legal and financial systems as well. Property registers, tax records, and civic accounts reflected realignment of ownership, responsibilities, and obligations, mapping the absence of the family onto practical matters of administration. Couriers delivered sealed orders with the same quiet precision as before. Their movement, a silent but essential component of continuity, officials carried out their duties without commentary, confident that the records themselves contained sufficient authority. In this way, practical governance and curated remembrance became intertwined. The smooth operation of the state depended upon the reliability of archives, and the structure of those archives depended upon the selective inclusion of certain families while others faded from view. Authority, once abstract, was rendered concrete through these bureaucratic rhythms, turning historical omission into a foundation for institutional coherence. The long-term consequence of these processes was a subtle but pervasive recalibration of civic expectation. Citizens encountered the city's order through inscriptions, public offices, and ceremonies, rarely noticing that certain names had been excised from the ledger of history. Their experience of continuity was maintained, yet shaped by the absence of what had been removed. Political ambition and social mobility were increasingly evaluated within the parameters defined by existing visibility. Prominence depended on records, patronage, and sanctioned acknowledgement rather than inherited reputation alone. The family, once ordinary participants in Republican society, had become an invisible reference point, their absence silently reinforcing the authority of those who remained within the new framework. Memory had been rendered a tool of structural governance, a way of aligning society with the imperatives of power. Across time, the pattern repeated itself, with subsequent generations of clerks, magistrates, and historians perpetuating the absence as an invisible constant. Each adjustment, whether the reallocation of land, the reassignment of offices, or the omission of a name in a genealogical scroll, was reinforced by ritualized procedure and careful documentation. Candlelight in quiet offices illuminated the meticulous work of copying, sealing, and filing. The movements of hands over parchment echoing decisions made long ago in rooms small enough for a single scribe and silent courier. By structuring memory through repetition and routine, the state ensured that absence became invisible, embedded into the very infrastructure of administration. What was not written, when consistently unrecorded, became indistinguishable from what had never existed. Even in distant provinces, the consequences manifested in subtle ways. Officials trained in Rome applied the same principles of selective remembrance, pruning local histories and records to conform with expectations set by the central administration. Names of families who had once participated prominently in civic life, now absent from central registers, were likewise diminished in local awareness, their presence recalled only in fragmented anecdotes or vestigial inscriptions. The empire, in consolidating its reach, relied upon both visible and invisible structures. Conquest established boundaries, while erasure shaped perception, ensuring that authority could operate smoothly across both space and time. By the time Rome's imperial system was fully established, the erasure of this single bloodline had contributed to a larger pattern in which memory was curated, continuity enforced, and authority normalized through the subtle orchestration of absence. It was a quiet consequence, unremarkable in daily life, yet fundamental in shaping the empire's enduring structures. Administrative precision, archival consistency, and social adaptation together produced a city and state whose stability depended not only on the visible exercise of power, but on the careful regulation of what could be remembered, repeated, and recorded. The family's disappearance was no longer merely a historical note. It had become woven into the logic of governance itself, an invisible thread sustaining the empire while remaining quietly, deliberately, absent. In the aftermath of centuries, when the city itself had absorbed countless cycles of memory and erasure, the traces of the family lingered only in fragmentary form, scattered across Rome's streets, archives, and worn stones, as though the city had exhaled their presence into subtle echoes rather than leaving clear testimony. A ledger tucked behind a heavier folio might record an unfamiliar name alongside a property reassignment. A faint impression on marble could hint at a dedication erased with careful precision. A corridor in a long-abandoned villa might bear the indentation of a door now blocked, or a threshold silently marked by the passing of those once connected to the house. Scholars, working by candlelight in libraries that smelled of dust, oil and parchment, pieced together these fragments with meticulous care, unfolding scrolls from forgotten drawers, lifting the lids of boxes whose contents have long been undisturbed, tracing the faint impressions of writings smudged by time. Each detail is partial, often ambiguous, leaving interpretation open and provisional. Yet even in the absence of certainty, a pattern emerges, subtle as the soft reflection of moonlight on the Tiber, revealing how lives once lived, and names once spoken aloud, contributed to the shape of the city and its memory. The physical spaces of the city carry hints of this history. Streets in quiet neighborhoods, worn by generations of travelers, may lead past villas whose facades have been patched, repurposed or integrated into newer construction, yet where shadows fall differently. One senses the impression of absent spaces once vibrant with domestic and political activity, now absorbed into ordinary continuity. Courtyards that once hosted small gatherings of patrons and clients now collect rain and fallen leaves, their stones smooth under years of neglect and routine maintenance alike. Windows shuttered or open, frame interiors stripped of identifying marks, yet occasionally a carved motif, a recess for a bust, or a fragment of mosaic recalls a household that once mattered in ways no longer acknowledged. These traces do not narrate heroism, nor do they demand notice. They exist quietly, awaiting recognition through observation, the slow unfolding of awareness that draws the past into contact with the present. Archival traces, where they survive, are equally restrained. Scrolls and codices often preserve references only indirectly, mentioning officers, properties, or civic duties without linking them explicitly to a vanished family name. Marginal notes, faded in ink, or corrections in a clerk's hand hint at intervention, deliberate or procedural, without narrating intention. The gaps themselves convey meaning. The absences function as quiet indicators of what has been removed, as if the structure of the archive were aware of what it cannot or will not speak. Scholars tracing these threads must work patiently, weighing minor variations, noting the sequence of entries, cross-referencing fragments in disparate collections. Their work is contemplative, almost meditative, attuned to the silence that falls between preserved lines and the faint reverberations of those erased from view. In this way, memory persists not in bold assertion, but in the quiet architecture of omission. Some fragments appear in public spaces, embedded in stone and bronze, inscriptions that were altered, letters carefully removed, or blank spaces where names once stood carry an unintended eloquence. One might pause before a column, noting the irregularity of spacing, the slight smoothing of stone, and imagine the hand that made the change, the small room in which the clerk worked by candlelight, the ink and chisel tracing the deliberate absence. Statues once aligned with the family's visibility remain as unremarkable civic ornaments, their identity absorbed into the broader narrative of the city. The absence, preserved so precisely, is as informative as presence. It marks both the reach of authority and the quiet efficiency of systemic erasure. Even every day, objects offer fragments of recognition, a ledger recording rent, a vessel marked with a seal, a collection of letters never delivered, a faint indentation where a tablet rested in a drawer. All of these survive as hints, tangible evidence of a network once intertwined with the family's existence. These objects carry the weight of ordinary life, of relationships, obligations, and routines, and their survival allows reconstruction of context, though not of personal detail. Couriers who delivered instructions, often unremarked at the time, now appear as ghostly participants in the shaping of history, their measured steps linking the administrative and domestic spheres. Their silence, as critical then as it is now, emphasizes the subtlety with which the machinery of erasure operated. No spectacle, no confrontation, only the careful management of documents, doors, and daily practices. Time softens even these traces. Roofs collapse, walls are repaired, and mosaics fade under footsteps and weather. Yet the continuity of the city preserves the memory in aggregate. One can follow the movement of influence, the flow of property, the shift of civic function, and glimpse the outline of a network once connected to the family. These outlines exist as indirect testimony, visible not in overt statements but in patterns, in the way resources were realigned, in the rhythm of municipal administration. In the quiet study of these patterns, the erased household re-emerges as a structural presence, shaping how historians understand the transformation from republic to empire, not as actors upon the stage but as silent points of reference within the architecture of power. The reflective distance required to trace this history is itself a form of observation. One does not search for narrative climax or heroic restoration. The task is to acknowledge persistence within absence, to perceive the ways in which memory and record, architecture and document, participate in a slow dialogue across time. Scholars turn over parchment carefully, noting creases, folds, and fading, feeling the weight of each alteration, each omission, each fragmentary line of text. They compare handwriting, ink composition, and placement within the archive, allowing the evidence to speak in subtle ways about institutional priorities, procedural decision-making, and the integration of absence into functioning governance. Candlelight, reflecting off walls lined with scrolls, illuminates both the physical act of preservation and the conceptual weight of what remains unseen. Even in reflection, certainty is provisional. Architectural voids hint at vanished families, yet their interpretation remains careful, tempered by recognition of the many factors that shape decay, reuse, and adaptation. A scholar might linger over a threshold, observing the uneven paving stones, the shadow of a shuttered window, considering the echoes of domestic life once present. Letters may be traced not to understand motives, but to document procedural adjustments. Property transfers may be charted not to assert ownership, but to observe continuity in administration. All of these small acts accumulate, creating a lattice through which historical presence can be inferred. Even when names have been lost entirely, the city itself participates in this quiet testimony. Streets continue to wind along ancient foundations, markets thrive along routes established centuries prior, and the Tiber flows with the indifference of time, carrying echoes of countless generations. Within this ongoing rhythm, the traces of the family persist as small disturbances in the surface of continuity, their absence acknowledged in the careful reading of archives, the attentive observation of buildings, and the reflection upon networks once interlinked. Memory is not restored, it is understood as layered, cumulative, and selective, existing in part through what has been preserved, and in part through what remains intentionally unspoken. Thus, when names are gone, there remains still a framework upon which history may rest, a subtle architecture of evidence that demands neither closure nor resolution. Fragments, impressions, and procedural traces allow the mind to reconstruct context without reconstructing individual lives. Architecture, documents, and indirect reference combine to create a landscape of observation in which absence becomes a form of presence. The past is never fully recovered, yet it is sensed, traced, and acknowledged, its contours shaping our perception of continuity, authority, and change. In the quiet stillness of streets, libraries, and empty courtyards, one perceives the enduring impact of lives that have been deliberately and a historical humility takes hold. Recognition that silence and uncertainty are as much a part of the city's memory as the names and deeds still spoken aloud, forming a landscape of understanding that is both fragile and profound.